Science has no clear message regarding the health benefits of saturated fats, it seems. Mainstream media has claimed that saturated fats should be avoided at all costs, with many experts illustrating scientific evidence that detail how. Recently, however, more evidence has come to light regarding the benefits of a high-fat, low-carb diet. But why is it so hard for experts to come to a simple consensus on whether or not dietary fats are good for you? In this video, we will discuss some possible reasons for an apparently never-ending fat and cholesterol controversy. Let's get straight into it. So, let us start off by asking, what are the fat facts and fat fiction? The facts of the matter are that saturated fats do not increase the risk of cardiovascular disease, as illustrated by Dr. Ramsden, who with his team evaluated previously unpublished data from the Minnesota coronary experiment of 1968 to 1973. On the other hand, other studies published around the same time tell the complete opposite story. To further compound this issue, some investigations that use dietary questionnaires to assess saturated fat intake by participants have many discrepancies in the methods used to collect their evidence. What this method of investigation involves is asking participants questions regarding their current diet at one moment in time, and then using that information to gauge risk of coronary heart disease in the future. This is not the most stringent guidelines to be following. This is due to the ease at which errors like under- and over-reporting of dietary intake tend to be more severe with saturated fats camouflaged in a diversity of foods such as sauces and snacks, in contrast to easily countable items like cups of coffee. Believe it or not, this is a very common study design. To expand on the point alluded to earlier, one study used said questionnaire once in a 25-year timeframe to gauge saturated fat intake for their investigation, whilst another used the questionnaire 8 times in the same time period. As you can probably guess, both studies came to completely different conclusions. Now that we have a little background information, let's move on to taking a closer look at the placebo problem. In nutritional science, all randomized controlled trials, RCTs, on hard endpoints such as cardiovascular disease events or mortality suffer from the serious limitation of being neither placebo-controlled nor double-blind. To recap quickly, a randomized control trial is a study in which a number of similar people are randomly assigned to 2 or more groups to test a specific drug, treatment, or other intervention. One group, the experimental group, has the intervention being tested, which is usually a drug. The other, the comparison or control group, has an alternative intervention, placebo, or no intervention at all. The groups are followed up to see how effective the experimental intervention was. Now, let's break down the 2 terms mentioned previously and understand exactly what they mean before we move on. A placebo is a medicine or procedure prescribed for the psychological benefit to the patient rather than any physiological effect. A double-blind trial takes this concept one step further so that both doctors administering the drug and the patients receiving the drug have no idea which group have been given the placebo and which hasn't. So, what does this mean about experimental evidence on saturated fats? Well, there are no possible placebo foods, like placebo ham or placebo steak, that can be eaten for as many years as it takes to complete a study on hard endpoints. Without access to a real placebo, the double-blind design fails. In effect, this means you will not be able to directly compare 2 identical diets by adjusting the presence of one food, for example steak, with something else that looks, feels, and tastes just like steak, but with a completely different macronutrient makeup. The lack of placebo RCTs was also a major obstacle to prove the harmful effects of tobacco smoking. Obviously, the powerful tobacco industry used the lack of evidence for their own benefit. Doubts on science may be manipulated for industry purposes. Important financial and political stakeholders are involved in the sales and production of foods, with fats as no exception. Certainly, big food corporations may also benefit from the ensuing confusion and doubt about scientific results. This brings us to the second area of discussion, the energy balance equation. In contrast to pharmaceuticals, macronutrients like fat contain energy. In an experimental energy-controlled design, this implies that an increased intake of one nutrient will lead to a decreased intake of another nutrient. If fat is replaced by carbohydrate or protein, the isolated effect of fat will be influenced by a change in the other macronutrients to keep the diet isocaloric, making the isolated effect of one macronutrient difficult to measure. What this means is that a meal consisting of 30 grams of saturated fat, 20 grams of proteins, and 50 grams of carbohydrates cannot be compared directly to another meal consisting of 50 grams of protein and 50 grams of carbohydrate. Even if the meal in question was reduced to 10 grams of saturated fat, 40 grams of protein, and 50 grams of carbohydrate, any positive impact of this dietary change may be attributed to an increase in protein intake as equally as the reduction of saturated fat. What's more, the topic of replacing saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats has caused the most controversy about the evidence for making public health recommendations. Since the 1960s, the evidence has suggested that replacing saturated fats in the diet with polyunsaturated fats reduces the risk of chronic disease and premature death. In practice, this means replacing red and processed meat with high-fat dairy, fish, nuts, and seeds, and replacing animal fats such as butter and lard with vegetable oils such as corn, sunflower, soy, rapeseed, or olive oils. The PREDIMED study, a large primary prevention randomized controlled trial on people at high risk of cardiovascular disease, reported that increased intake of extra virgin oil or nuts with a Mediterranean diet significantly reduced the incidence of cardiovascular disease compared with a low-fat dietary advice group. However, while the intake of unsaturated fats increased in both the olive oil and nuts, this may have therefore contributed to the clinical outcomes. There was no nutrient substitution for saturated fats, and their intake was not reduced compared with the low-fat dietary advice group. How this evidence should be interpreted and applied still remains controversial. In summary, it is clear that experimental designs themselves are wanting, and in conjunction with the lack of placebo-controlled RCTs, the ensuing state of confusion is inevitable. Finding willing participants for a control group eating placebo ham for many years is also slim to none. Clearly, the debate on saturated fats will be vibrant for many years to come. Thank you for making it to the end of this video. If you haven't already, smash that like button and subscribe for more future content.